How important do you feel mixing skills are for composers and producers today?
So, this is such a great question because once upon a time, producers and composers didn't need mixing chops at all. You always had a budget to send off to a mixing engineer. You just needed to get down a great idea. Now, at least on the composing side, most companies that I know that deal with sync music do not pay to get their tracks mixed. There are a select few that do, and that's an amazing thing. But as far as like composers in general, having mixing skills will allow you to land your music in more libraries with higher quality publishers, and more trailer spots, or any kind of ads or promo spots, because simply for the fact that whenever you submit your music to a publisher, if they listen to the music and right off the bat they can tell, like, wow, this music sounds incredible, the mix sounds incredible, this composer is quality. There's like this perceived value of whenever you listen to somebody's music, for the first 5 seconds, and you jump into the middle or to the end of a track and it just all sounds professional, your immediate reaction towards that person is like, wow, this person is amazing. Like, I want to work with them. So, that's on the composing side. And on the producing side, I think having mixing chops just overall makes your production just so much tighter and better, because throughout the writing process, how much room there is, headroom, but how much room in the overall track to add more layers, to have a thicker or a more punchy kick, to have a thicker bass line, or maybe it needs to go up an octave. Maybe, you want to add another synth layer, but there's just not room in the mix for it. If you already have those mixing chops, you will know this, during the writing phase, as opposed to trying to fix it later in the mix. So I think that that's huge. And the last point here is that if you're an indie artist releasing your own music, you're not going to have the budget or want to dish out the money to hire a mixer after the fact. You're going to want to do it all yourself. And so it's paramount to be able to be an artist today, to have mixing skills.
In your experience, what are labels and publishers looking for when they're listening to new composers?
So for composers in particular, I would say whenever receiving music from a composer, I generally wanted to hear, and this is from my past, but still today I get music from composers and artists. I'd really love to receive a Dropbox link. This sounds goofy, but that's just the industry standard. And whenever it's something else like a Google Drive or a Box link or WeTransfer, it just doesn't come off as professional. I know this sounds silly, but that's the truth. And the next step is I would love to have 3 to 5 tracks max, all in the same genre, in the same vein of each other. Like, they could be on an album together. And I would love all of them to sound, obviously musically phenomenal and interesting, and, something that just catches your ear. But going back to mixing, if I hear a track that is just so far away from being ready to show the world, it makes me, and I'm sure anybody else listening to that track, feel already less passionate about helping that person, because we see the mountain that we're going to have to climb is just so steep. It's like, if the mixing chops aren't there, I'm going to have to hire a mixer to mix this. So that's more on top of the budget. Or, it means that this person really just hasn't put the time and effort into this track. And so it doesn't make me want to put time and effort into this track on the publishing side. So, those are the paramount things, is just like great track selection. Don't give me 5 different genres. Let's choose a genre that you feel incredibly good about. Great mixes, a Dropbox link. You can use free Dropbox. I think it was 2 gigs. I don't know if it still is, but Dropbox. And then after that, just a short synopsis or something of whenever you're submitting to me, like, hey, my name is so-and-so. I wrote a couple tracks in the vein of this that I would love to make into an album. I'm sending it to you because I think that this would be the best home for it. What do you think? Just something that simple. Don't go into a long explanation. Just something just like that would catch my eye and hopefully my ear as well.
What are some of the most common mixing problems that you hear in especially beginner composers' music, but as well as intermediate composers?
So most certainly the biggest thing, which I mean we are going to cover in this first workshop, is the low end. And I'm sure that anybody listening to this can attest. The low end is generally the most tough thing to dial in a track. It has to do with your monitoring system, your room, your headphones. You know, what is on your mix bus? Is it helping glue the entire track together? Do you have some notes in your bass line that are just so resonant compared to other notes, and so those ones jump out of the mix? You know, how do you dial that in? That's kind of like one of the biggest mixing things that I always get asked about. But you know, other than that, having either a very bright mix or a very dark mix, you know, both of those have to do with monitoring again, because you know, in some speakers, like I use Genelex and they're very bright, but I have software that flattens them. On Genelex, most people's intuition would be to turn down the high end, so they'd have a very dark mix. And while you know that works for some genres, certainly not for trailer music. I mean, we want big, exciting, and exciting comes from hard hitting and a nice top end sheen on a track. The high end is what catches our ears. So you want to have a good amount of it, just not too much. So that's another issue. And then I would really just say the final point here is not having a lot of weight in a mix. And what I mean by that is each sound itself, you know, this could be, you know, your some rototoms or some taikos or your brass or, you know, a string line or, you know, a choir. All these individual sounds aren't thick enough in, you know, by themselves. So in the mix, everything sounds thin, but all together, it doesn't really get any more thick. And the way around that is adding saturation, adding layers, knowing how to use mix bus processing to really get every ounce of energy and thickness out of a track. You know, these 3 points, I think if most all producers and composers could dial in, their mixes would do an entire 180. It would be significant.
You mentioned monitoring and headphones. What's your advice for people that don't really have a really fancy studio that is perfectly acoustically treated and most likely just work from their bedroom with studio monitors or a set of headphones?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that, you know, this is where most people are at, I would think, is not having a properly treated room, just because, I mean, it costs a lot of money to properly treat one. And then to get, you know, really nice monitors and possibly a sub, you know, we're talking thousands and thousands, and it could be tens of thousands. So in this case, I think that there is one thing that literally everybody should do, even if you have a really nice setup, is get some kind of software like SonarWorks. I'm a huge fan of theirs because given any situation in any room, you could bring SonarWorks into there, and you could have the same exact mix or sound replication that you can in another space. So, you know, SonarWorks has a studio version that's for monitors, and they also have a version that's for headphones. And I would particularly tell everybody to use the system-wide, I suppose it's called Sound ID now, but use the system-wide version, which means that all sound from your computer goes through this software, not just the audio from your DAW. And the reason for this is if you're on, you know, SoundCloud, if you're on Spotify, YouTube, if you're playing a video game, whatever, that sound is going through Sound ID and being basically EQ'd and phase corrected so that your listening environment is always flat. That way, no matter what you're listening to, your ears are getting trained to hear sound flat. If you only have it through your DAW, like it's, you know, people put it on their master chain and, or at the end of the mastering chain, and that way all audio from your DAW goes through it. But whenever you're listening through Spotify or Tidal or any of these other streaming softwares or video games or anything, you're hearing again the uncorrected audio, and it doesn't train your ear to hear things flat. So ear training and just flattening out your either headphones or monitors is like the biggest thing that you could ever possibly do for your mixing skills. Before the getting a tight low end, before getting, you know, the highs or you know, bright or dark, any of these things corrected, if you have monitoring that tells you, you know, a flat image and phase corrected, everything will change. That was the biggest thing that I ever did for myself is getting flat frequency response out of my monitors and sub. I mean, it sounds like I'm getting paid by them, but I just love their stuff so much. I have no affiliation or anything. I just think that is like the simplest thing that any person could do. Yes, it costs a couple $100 if you do the studio one, but that will pay dividends immediately on your very first mix. I mean, it will be night and day.
What are some tips and some things people can do straight away after listening to this that can help improve their mixing workflow and their results?
Yeah, there are two things that come to mind that could change everything. First of all, before you start ever mixing, literally before you put on your very first EQ, before you change any level, you need to have your mix bus set up. So what I mean by this is on my mix bus, what we can call my mastering chain, because it is bringing it to competitive loudness and giving me a proper curve that I want over the whole track, and some squashing with a multiband compressor. I do EQ, multiband compression, a clipper, and my BRICKWALL limiter. And then after that, I have a loudness meter. And if you get all of those things just on your mix bus from the get-go, it will change everything, because now you will hear your mix translating through a little bit of multiband compression. It'll translate through the clipper. It'll translate through my BRICKWALL limiter. And so every little move that I make, I can hear it through that processing. Now, what I hear a lot of people doing is they get deep into their mix. I mean, we're talking like almost all the way there. And then they will decide to put things on their mix bus, like some EQ, which might not be bad, but the thing that will destroy you is putting on a BRICKWALL limiter after your mix is done, because you'll start to push down on the limiter and all of a sudden your mix will fall apart. It will start distorting. Your mid-range will start really pushing out quite loud. I mean, it will take over the mix. You will have your top end become pretty harsh. You know, all these things that you just don't want, because it makes you have to remix the track. But if you were to have started your entire mix going through all of that, I promise you, like, side note here, all of the big mix engineers in the world do this. I mean, it's already all engaged. You can't put this on later in a mix, because it will change all of the choices that you made up until then. They won't translate the way that they were before. So just getting this set up before a mix starts will be a night and day difference. And number two is become a master of saturation. And what I mean by this is use plugins like DECAPITATOR or any kind of amp simulator, or kind of an overdrive, or one of my favorite new plugins is called Spectre. It's a multiband saturation unit, or I suppose it looks like an EQ, like a parametric EQ, but instead of just boosting volume, it's adding saturation in the little bands that you're creating. Isotope has their multiband saturation units. These things right here add harmonic content to whatever source you're giving it. So if it is short strings, maybe it's some kind of ostinato line, I will throw a decapitator on it and only get it to about 2 on the drive, and then I'll put it to the E setting, which I just call, quote unquote, like the exciting setting, but I think it's an EMI emulation. And just by giving it a little bit of saturation, you will get maybe 3 or 4, or maybe even possibly like 5 dB extra loudness out of that signal without actually making it volume louder, because it has automatic volume compensation. So literally by just giving it a little saturation, you're giving that sound much more thickness and loudness in the process. And overall, if you just do little bitty subtle saturation in proper spots on your audio sources, your overall track is going to be thicker, louder, more exciting. That's how you take it from being a brittle, thin track to something that actually has weight. I think that these two things could elevate anybody's mixes from wherever you're at to a substantial amount better.
You got a workshop coming up with us this Friday. What are a couple of key takeaways you want people that attend there to take away home after that workshop?
Well, so this workshop is going to cover tightening the low end of your track. And this could be a hybrid orchestral track. We're going to do a hip hop track. We're also going to do this really cool synthwave pop track. So, if you were to attend this workshop, the thing that I want you to take home is, one, how to keep your low end thick, tight, and not distorted. And not aesthetically distorting your low end signal, but whenever you clamp down on that final brick wall limiter, how to keep that low end from distorting. Other things here are, how do we keep your low end consistent throughout the entire mix? Because I am sure that if you're listening to this, you have had the low end of your track, go into the chorus and the first note sounds, but then weirdly, like the second note is really resonant and it really pokes out of the mix. How to deal with that? These are two of the most major things that I think people need help with, and we're certainly going to cover that. But finally, one of the really, really big things that is tough is how to have your low end translate over an iPhone, because people watch trailers on phones, of course, but then how does it also translate over a TV speaker? How does it translate in the car? Because we already know that people love, getting in their car and playing, let's just, throw out anything like a audio machine track. They love going to an album and it in the car. How do we get that low end to just sound really thick and hammer hard in a car, but also sound good on a little Amazon Alexa speaker? This is crucial for this genre. Well, all the genres I just listed, but since Evenant is deeply into the hybrid orchestral market, just that is such a niche group of listeners that they actually really listen to those things. And I know friends who study for exams listening to this stuff. So they're on, little AirPods. We have to make all of these people happy with the mixes that we're creating. And so we're going to cover in detail how to make that happen.